Hi, everyone. Since becoming a Baha'i, I've been fascinated with the vision of a world governed cooperatively for the good of all humanity. So it was really exciting to discover in April 2020 that 3 internationally engaged professionals who happen to be members of the Baha'i community had written a book with specific proposals for systemic change in global governance. It's a privilege to share a few of their proposals. And it was really interesting to study them alongside the writings of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi, the Universal House of Justice, and the Baha'i International Community, which had just come out with the publication A Governance Befitting in 2020. Shoghi Effendi wrote that the gradual diffusion of the spirit of world solidarity is spontaneously arising out of the welter of a disorganized society. The forces of integration are not always as apparent as those of disintegration, but they are strong and getting stronger. Yet, in the words of Maya Groff, Arthur Dowell, and Augusto Lopez Claros, the authors of Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century, at this point in our development, we are both blessed and plagued by institutions that are only half built. Shoghi Effendi explained in The World Order of Baha'u'llah, the unity of the human race, as envisaged by Baha'u'llah, implies the establishment of a world commonwealth in which all nations, races, creeds, and classes are closely and permanently united. The 1945 UN Charter, beginning with the words, "We the peoples," valiantly attempted to set out a structure for international cooperation for the peace and security of all peoples based on the rule of law. Great progress has been made, especially with the establishment of new social norms and new institutions, but much remains to be done for the UN to fulfill its promise. As far back as 1985, the Universal House of Justice wrote in The Promise of World Peace, whether peace is to be reached only after unimaginable horrors precipitated by humanity's stubborn clinging to old patterns of behavior, or is to be embraced now by an act of consultative will, is the choice before all who inhabit the earth. That statement seems even more pertinent now than it was 35 years ago. The Baha'i International Community, or BIC, spoke specifically of the UN in its 2020 publication, A Governance Befitting. The United Nations, they warned, is without parallel as a structure to engage all the world's nations and a forum to express humanity's common will. Yet, recent events demonstrate that current arrangements are no longer sufficient in the face of cascading and increasingly interconnected threats. One of the world's most urgent threats today is the climate crisis. Although there have been major international conferences on the environment since 1972, there is currently no enforcement mechanism other than moral peer pressure. A patchwork of conventions or agreements exists within and outside the UN system, with secretaries scattered around the world. But there are notable gaps, such as the lack of a convention on plastics or on forests. According to the authors of Global Governance, our best hope lies in creating a permanent global environmental organization mandated with negotiating a legally binding international treaty. The Baha'i International Community, writing in A Governance Befitting, agreed with the need for strengthening the legal framework relating to the natural world, which they say would provide a robust foundation for a system of common stewardship of the planet's resources. One of the most exciting discoveries in researching global governance issues was the current efforts underfoot as present, which receive far too little press. For example, the Global Pact for the Environment. In 2017, in order to bring some legal coherence to the approximately 1,500 environmental frameworks, treaties, agreements, and bodies, a group of 80 experts from 40 countries prepared this draft document. The pact assembles and codifies the main principles of international environmental law, which they hope will form the basis for negotiating a comprehensive and binding international treaty. In 2018, a General Assembly vote at the UN launched negotiations. And on February 17th, 2021, with the COVID-19 pandemic still raging, the Global Pact Coalition was launched. This is a civil society group with over 100 jurists and public figures to push states to recognize our right to a healthy planet and accept this global legal framework that better protects the Earth. Another key area needing urgent global attention is the enormous and increasing wealth inequality between nations, which is actually far higher than inequality within nations. The aim of the 2030 Agenda, signed in 2015, is to leave no one behind, increasing equality of opportunity. Its focus is on human rights. The agenda states, in a world without absolute scarcity, with adequate wealth to meet everyone's needs and enough food to feed everyone, it is unjust that people should go hungry or lack the basic necessities of life. A more just economic system is essential. The need for a new economic order has a long history. Punitive reparations debts imposed on Germany after World War I led ultimately to World War II, leaving Europe in ruins. In 1944, a global economic conference was called to end the era of beggar thy neighbor, cure the economic chaos, and create a safer, more prosperous world. The Bretton Woods Conference gathered 730 delegates from 44 allied nations in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. At the end of the 3-week conference, agreements were signed that established much of the financial infrastructure we have inherited today. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the precursor to the World Bank. The World Bank continues to provide development loans and grants to countries with the goal of ending extreme poverty. And in the absence of the single global currency, which is recommended by John Maynard Keynes, the International Monetary Fund seeks to improve cooperation and financial stability. The World Trade Organization operates outside the UN system. This global financial system is far from perfect, composed of a patchwork of organizations and ad hoc arrangements with no single UN economic organization. It should be of great concern that none of our institutions currently has the resources and authority to provide financial stability in times of crisis. According to the global governance authors, this system is more fragile now than it was in 2007, just before the last financial meltdown. And that was written before the pandemic started. In the vision of Shoghi Effendi, the economic resources of the world will be organized. Its sources of raw materials will be tapped and fully utilized. Its markets will be coordinated and developed, and the distribution of its products will be equitably regulated. He foresaw a world community in which all economic barriers will have been permanently demolished, and wrote, destitution on the one hand and gross accumulation of ownership on the other will disappear. The enormous energy dissipated and wasted on war, he said, would be used not just to further scientific and material development, but to the furtherance of any other agency that can stimulate the intellectual, the moral, and spiritual life of the entire human race. Adequate food, water, public health services, education of all children, shelter, are all considered basic rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948. So what would justice cost worldwide if that global agreement were to be implemented? Over 70 years later, 1 billion people live on less than $1.90 per day. There remain close to 800 million illiterate people in the world, the majority women. Meanwhile, $5.3 trillion is spent worldwide annually on the subsidization of fossil fuels, most of which goes to the top 20% of income earners. In addition, almost $2 trillion is spent worldwide on military budgets every year. The challenge is not scarcity. The challenge is having enough faith in ourselves and in each other to put our house in order on a global scale. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development states, we envisage a world of universal respect for human rights and human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality, and non-discrimination, a just, equitable, tolerant, open, and socially inclusive world in which the needs of the most vulnerable are met. The Baha'i international community agrees. Every effort to advance society, even if concerned with material conditions alone, rests on underlying moral assumptions. In other words, all policy is connected to spiritual principles or human values. Only by ensuring that material progress is consciously connected to spiritual and social progress, they write, can the promise of a better world be fulfilled. BIC also writes, what's needed today is a settled consensus that while preserving the various systems and cultures around the world, embodies a set of common values and principles that can attract the support of every nation. But how do we move to a more meritocratic world where wealth and well-being are not determined by place of birth? Effectively managing globalization means protecting the vulnerable and addressing global inequality. There are various ways to do this, including progressive or graduated taxation in addition to a wealth tax, for example, a 1% tax on wealth over 50 million. Employment creation, giving priority to providing meaningful employment for all in recognition of the dignity of work and of service. Gender equality, which is one of the 3 priorities of the 2030 Agenda. Profit sharing, which could be incentivized through legislation. And a universal basic income, which can have many positive economic, social, and psychological benefits, and could begin to lift up the poorest on the planet. One of the greatest needs of the modern world is for justice, or the rule of law. Shoghi Effendi wrote long ago of the need for a world tribunal that will adjudicate and deliver its compulsory and final verdict in all and any disputes that may arise between the various elements constituting this universal system. In 1945, the International Court of Justice was created as the principal organ to settle interstate disputes. This was critical in paving the path to peace. However, just 73 of the 193 states of the UN have accepted its jurisdiction to date, and the International Court of Justice has no say in countries that haven't accepted it. It's proposed in the Global Governance book that this be mandatory for all states. More recently, in 2002, the International Criminal Court was created. It prosecutes individuals for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. 122 of the 193 states of the UN have accepted its jurisdiction to date. Mandatory jurisdiction is proposed so that no state and no leader is above the law. The World Commonwealth described by Shoghi Effendi foresees a single code of international law, the product of the considered judgment of the world's federated representatives. Regarding the need to respect international law and uphold fundamental human rights through legal means, the Baha'i international community writes, barring this, no amount of administrative reorganization will solve the host of long-standing challenges before us. As Baha'u'llah declared, words must be supported by deeds, for deeds are the true test of words. The human family is one. This is a truth that has been embraced by multitudes around the world, writes the Baha'i international community, reminding us of the words of Baha'u'llah over a century ago. True peace and tranquility will only be realized when every soul will have become the well-wisher of all mankind. We find ourselves, they write, at the threshold of a defining task, purposefully organizing our affairs in full consciousness of ourselves as one people in one shared homeland. The Baha'i writings have encouraged and nourished this aspiration from the beginning. There seem to be key areas of philosophical questioning that require this spiritually based and pragmatic input now more than ever. It's very difficult to build a better world without having an articulated goal to work towards. What kind of future do we envision? What's the best case scenario? Does it include everyone? Is it realistic? Those questions need to be addressed as soon as possible by as many people as possible. So let's start with the small group discussions.